Hello and warmly welcome to Moderna Museet. My name is Camilla Karlberg and I'm the head of the learning department here at the museum. Today I'm extremely happy to welcome Hettie Judah. She is invited to give a lecture on the subject How Not to Exclude Artist Mothers and Other Parents. And I will give her and today's panel a more thorough presentation shortly. This is, as far as I can recall, the first baby-friendly lecture and panel debate that we have hosted here at Moderna Museet. We really do want to welcome parents, also with small children. And of course, we have programs and activities for infants and small children together with their parents. So we have also produced a video clip for our audience that would like to come here with their small children, and we're going to present it to you now.
Hej och välkommen till Moderna Museet. Jag heter Anita Wernström-Pitcher och jobbar som förmedlingsintendent här på Moderna Museet. Och jag har ett ansvarsområde för barn 0-12 år. Därför tänkte jag ge er några små tips vad man kan tänka på när man besöker museet med små barn. Här på museet har du lite olika alternativ. Det finns möjlighet att låna en vagn. Eller så kan du parkera din egen barnvagn här på en av våra barnvagnsparkeringar. Har du glömt ett lås så är det bara att fråga en av våra värdar så kan vi också låna ut ett sånt till er. På alla våningsplan har vi skötrum. Det lättaste sättet att ta dig runt i byggnaden är faktiskt att använda hissen. Här i restaurangen finns det alltid barnstolar att låna. Det finns även en barnmeny och mikro där du kan värma på din mat. Om du har tagit med dig matsäck eller frukt så kan du äta det i vårt matsäcksrum här på plan 1. Du kan alltid låna ett skåp där du kan lägga in vattenflaskor och andra saker som du inte kanske vill ha med dig in i museet. Du kanske har spring i benen eller vill sätta dig ner en liten stund och läsa en bok. Då kan du göra det här på plan 2. Välkommen till Moderna Museet.
Thank you so much, Camilla. And it is wonderful to see so many small visitors with us today. This is going to be an event that's very much held in the context of parenthood, the interrupted nature of working as a parent. So we will be expecting small children to possibly object to things we're doing and to maybe scream or make noise during the event. We welcome breastfeeding. We will anticipate possibly stage invasions. And if you need to leave the space with your child, if you need to change them or anything else, please feel free to move around the space. This is a relaxed event and you're all very welcome to be here and to fulfill the needs of your child in any way that is possible in this auditorium. So my name's Hettie Judah. I've been working on the subject of art and motherhood, particularly the impact of motherhood on artists' careers, for about 4 or 5 years now. It's not my only subject. I write about art in quite a broad way, and my books have included other subjects, including stone, most recently. And so, I mean, my topics are quite wide, but I started to think really about artist mothers when a number of studies started to appear on gender balance in the art world about 5 years ago. So in the Anglophone world, there have been quite a few studies. I don't know whether there have been similar studies in Sweden. That's something I'd love to talk to Sara about afterwards. In the United States, there have been a series of reports done by Charlotte Burns and Julia Halperin called the Burns-Halperin reports, published at ArtNet. In Australia, there have been the Countess reports. And in the UK, there have been a series of reports, about 7 or 8 now, backed by the Freelands Foundation, looking at the representation of female artists in Britain. And I think quite often in the art world you get a very different picture if you stop listening to all of the kind of liberal, wonderfully progressive things that are being said in public and are being expressed by institutions, and you start to look at where the money's going and where the money's being invested. I think your friends are up there on this side. They're waving to you. You can also sit at the front. There's like baby toys and squishy things here if you'd like. It's okay, don't worry. It's all very relaxed and acceptable. Don't worry at all. Yeah, so in the UK, in the last few years, since we've had a more conservative regime in the UK, tertiary education has been fee paying, and it's become big business. And there's been a huge inflation in the number of people, for example, studying on MA courses. And I was really interested in the disparity between two sets of statistics in the 2018 version of this report. The first one is a graph showing the applicants to postgraduate art and design courses. And this graph shows that 66% of the applicants to these courses are female and non-binary, and the remainder are male. So this is for a fee-paying postgraduate course. That would be an MA or a PhD in an art or design subject. The next set of figures is this one here on the right. That's your left, sorry, on the left, which shows the representation of artists by commercial galleries in London. So this shows a complete inversion of the figures. 68% of the artists represented by commercial galleries in London are male, and the remainder are female and non-binary. And I was really, I mean, that's quite a shocking, to me, gender balance. But I was really interested as to what was happening between those two sets of figures. And roughly, I felt that the graph showing applicants to postgraduate art and design courses was kind of representing the status quo, shall we say, for artists in their 20s. And this was really showing what happened further down into an artist's career. Let's say you get gallery representation in your mid-30s. And I was interested as to whether there was anything that wasn't showing up in the figures. I mean, we can all just assume that it's just the art world being bad and sexist, but was something else going on? And quite often something that happens to people in their 30s is that they become parents. And I became interested as to whether this had any impact on artists' careers. Because really from this point, from the mid-30s, the studies all showed that the relative career trajectories of male and female and non-binary artists started to diverge really quite steeply. So it wasn't just to do with getting gallery representation, it was also whether they received major institutional shows, whether their work was represented in collections, what their auction prices started to look like, whether they participated in biennials. So really this split really does seem to happen in the 30s in an artist's kind of, when they're around 30 to 40. So I started talking to Dr. Kate Macmillan, who was the author of this report. And she invited me to write an essay looking at the impact of motherhood on artists' careers. I'm normally quite lazy about this kind of thing, so I typically would have probably just interviewed, let's say, 6 artists about the impact of motherhood. But I started work on the essay probably quite close to the deadline being me in March 2020. And I suddenly had an awful lot of time on my hands. I had no more exhibitions left to review because we were on lockdown in the UK. And many people were obviously stuck at home with their families. So I put an open call out onto Instagram and I got this enormous response. Many people kind of had very strong things to say about the impact of motherhood on their career as an artist. And I ended up interviewing just over 50 artists. They were all artists based in the UK, but they were from quite a wide variety of geographical backgrounds, from Peru right through to China and South Asia. And it was a very emotional experience. Lots of people had really suffered quite a lot, and they'd felt very excluded from the art world. They'd felt they become invisible as soon as they became parents. And through these interviews, I started to build up a picture of the structural ways in which the art world, quite often just through being thoughtless, was excluding artist mothers and artist parents. So I'm going to go through just a couple of the artists that I interviewed in the study, and I've pulled out a few quotes that are in many ways quite typical of the kinds of response I was getting. So this is an artist called Razia Waheed. She's a textile artist. She was quite well established in the UK before becoming a parent. So she has an MBE, which is a kind of national kind of recognition. She was working really at the intersection of craft and art, shall we say, and also doing quite a lot of education work and kind of socially based projects with galleries. This work that she's holding is a work called Dancing in the Womb, and it's a synesthetic response to her 4 pregnancies. So with each pregnancy, she had the impression of a different colour and a different smell and a different kind of rhythm with each child. So you can see the colours kind of evolve as they go up, this woven piece here. Razia said, "Once people found out that I was pregnant, the distancing started happening. There were no conversations, just a lack of communications and offers. I was seen as not creating work or not being able to create work. When I told people I was creating and I could participate in exhibitions, I was either seen as lying or telling half-truths." This was a very, very common pattern, that you'd have an artist who'd develop really quite good long-term relationships with curators and with commissioning bodies. And really, as soon as they announced they were pregnant, those relationships came to a close. There wasn't a conversation about whether the artist was still interested in, participating or was open to commissions. The curators just stopped contacting them completely. And I think this also is very emblematic of quite a paternalistic attitude towards pregnant people and parents, that as soon as essentially you become pregnant, you become a parent, you become a mother, there is this idea that you are, in a way, you have this different social status, and that other people feel that they know what's best for you. Even if you say that you want to work, other people feel that they somehow have a kind of ownership over you and your activities as a parent. This is a performance artist called Echo Morgan. She works quite a lot with body paint and with Chinese calligraphic characters on her body. And I've found over the talks that I've done in the last few weeks that actually, although she's a performance artist, in general there's a particular problem, I think, for dancers and performance artists, where there seems to be quite a strong taboo around performing as a pregnant person. So Echo said, "When I found out I was pregnant, 2 of my international performances got cancelled. Both curators were actually female, but without children. They both emailed me and said, 'Good luck with the family life. If you ever decide to perform again in the future, please keep us informed.'" Again, there's this kind of paternalistic feeling that you know best what's right for a pregnant person or a mother. And these curators were very much making these decisions without having had any kind of conversation up front with the artist. There was a refusal to be flexible and to accommodate the artist's requirements. In fact, in this case, the artist wasn't demanding anything. They weren't asking for anything extra. It was just decided that because this performance artist who worked with her body in a very visible way was pregnant, it was no longer acceptable that she participated as a pregnant person. What also comes out here is that quite often women aren't necessarily the best allies to other women, and indeed older mothers are not always necessarily the best allies to younger mothers. What I found quite often happening in the study was that older mothers felt that younger mothers needed to experience the exclusionary structures and the taboos that they'd been through themselves, and that they weren't actually prepared to make things easier, to be more accommodating to younger parents. This is an artist called Emma Franks, who she's mainly a painter, but she also makes fantastic performance costumes, including costumes for her menopausal punk band, Hot Flush. Emma, I think, makes a really interesting point about mothers' status in society, the way they're perceived as cultural or not cultural figures. She says, "I don't think society takes artists or mothers seriously, so being an artist and mother is a double whammy." In the UK, certainly, the mother is seen as a very comic figure culturally. If you watch movies, quite often the mother's kind of played for laughs. They're not seen as being a serious figure. Indeed, the middle-aged woman in general is seen as a comic trope, I think, in the UK. They're certainly not really seen as being people who are going to make a serious, perhaps even experimental and avant-garde contribution towards culture. So this is a bit of a kind of stereotype that needs to be broken through if the figure of the artist mother is to be seen as a serious figure, if their input to the culture is to be considered in a serious way. This is an artist called Rosalind Farham. She had, I think, quite a difficult time as an artist mother. I think she was a single parent. She had a number of children, some of them requiring, I think, extra care. And this comment from her is in many ways very typical of the kind of feedback I was getting from older artist parents who'd had to take, say, 10 or 15 years out of making art. And it's very sad, but I think it's also something that we need to consider when we think about artist mothers. She says, "I recall someone asking me what I did, and I said, I'm an artist. And they said, how can you be an artist when you don't make things and you don't sell the things you don't make?" So for many people who've had to take a period away from making work on a large scale or showing work, there is this moment of, shall we say, an identity crisis that happens to people. And I think when we talk about artist mothers, we need to really consider this group of artist mothers as well. So artist mothers are not just these lovely people in front of me with their young children. They're also people who've had to take, say, 10 or 15 years, possibly even 20 years out of the art world, and they've become invisible. And they suddenly find that it's very, very difficult to come back into the art world. There are very few structures that will make it easy for them to start participating again. Obviously, all of the issues that the art world presents are a thing in themselves. There is also, of course, a bigger structural issue, a societal issue, which is the gender pay gap. Wherever we have a gender pay gap, we're going to have a gendered care gap. So if you have a heterosexual couple, it will generally be the higher earning member of that couple that goes back to work, and the lower earning member of that couple who becomes the primary caregiver. If we have a single parent, of course, there is absolutely no option. They have full-time care. But in a queer couple, generally, if one member of that couple is an artist, because of the precarious nature of art working, it tends to be the artist who becomes the caregiver. So here in Sweden, if you're a woman or non-binary, you're much more likely to work part-time, which suggests that you are more likely to become the caregiver. And there are obviously structural inequalities that are very evident in Sweden, even as a fantastically equal society, much better than most other countries in Europe. It's still present here as an issue. So having done the study, I, of course, felt that it was really important that I started to try and find ways to kind of improve the situation. So I worked with a group of 30 artist mothers on a manifesto. We worked on it very collaboratively. And this manifesto came out at the start of 2021. It's available in 15 languages. It has been translated into Swedish. Unfortunately, I'm working unfunded, and and the website was made for me in code, and so I need to get somebody else to update it, and they've stopped replying to my emails. I think not because I'm an obnoxious person, just because I don't pay very well. So it will be up in Swedish very soon. If there's anybody that's a fantastic coder who would like to put this up onto the website in Swedish, please get in touch with me. So we opened this the manifesto with a line from one of the artists who contributed to it, Mel Jackson. She does a lot of very interesting work on the subject of milk and the politics of milk. Mel said, "Supporting diversity, whether it be age, ethnicity, gender, loan or parental status, isn't just about being fair. It's also about allowing a diverse flow of experience, nuance, innovation and invention to flourish, so the work, the gallery, the practice of art is as rich as it can be." This point about fairness, I think, is incredibly important, because there is quite often this perception that we need to be inclusive because it's morally correct. I'd say that actually this call to be inclusive is not anything to do with fairness necessarily. It's to do with looking at what's lacking from the art world, and an art world that excludes work about motherhood, parenthood, or excludes anybody because of their race, ethnicity, their sexual orientation, is an art world that doesn't represent the full richness of human experience. So you're not looking at the kind of the diverse experiences, the whole, shall we say, the spectrum of emotional response. So it's very important to the art world that this kind of thing is made, that art that explores parenthood, motherhood, becomes integrated into the collections, and that the art world is less excluding two parents for this reason, not just because it's right, but because, you know, it's going to actually benefit the art world. We also had a couple of introductory statements and points. The first is one to do with the language that we use in this area. So bear in mind that this was written in the midst of the pandemic, where lots of people were stuck at home, and certainly in the UK, the balance of care overwhelmingly fell to mothers, even though both parents were at home. So this first point is responsibility for childcare currently falls overwhelmingly on mothers, but we're using the word parent in these guidelines in the hope that this may change. So there's a lot of conversation about the language that we use in this area. There's a very strong argument that if we talk about this as a parent's issue, then it becomes a societal issue, and that it's more likely to elicit change than if we just discuss this as just a woman's issue. There's also, I think, a very strong point to be made that if we don't use the term mothers, that we risk making 5 centuries of unpaid women's labour invisible, that we don't acknowledge all of that unpaid labour that goes on and the gender balance of labour. There's also a suggestion to treat the artist as a whole person, and an introductory request, be flexible. So if we're going to encapsulate my book and most of my work in 2 words, really be flexible is, you know, kind of gets to the nub of everything that that I talk about, really. So it's behoven to the art institutions, to residencies, to grant-giving bodies, to galleries, to be flexible, to have conversations with artists, not to assume that you know what's right for them, not to assume that you know what they want, but to really start to have those conversations. So the first point, as an organisation, be explicitly welcoming to artists with families. Thank you very much, Moderna Museet. You've done a fantastic job today. Be breastfeeding friendly. Stay in contact with artists when they become parents. The art does not need to be family friendly, but the institution should be. So being a family friendly institution also includes thinking about the artist, the parent, as a thinking person that might also want to participate in you know, a debate in an adult oriented event rather than just participating in family events. But this also goes to things like content warnings, so outlining whether a particular exhibition is suitable for people to visit with children, because actually sometimes it's really important to know that it's not suitable. And I'm certainly not saying that all exhibitions or all events at a museum should be suitable for children and families. It's really important that we show a full diversity of different kinds of work. So if an exhibition is not suitable for somebody to visit with a child, it's also very important that people know that. Point 2 is make it standard practice to establish an artist's family circumstances at the outset of a project and have structures in place to accommodate their parenting responsibilities. It shouldn't be left to the artist to have to confess to being a parent or to fear they may lose a show, commission or residency if they do so. This fear that artists have is really well founded. Quite often people do lose out on important opportunities if it's found out that they're pregnant or that they're a parent. So while I've been doing these conversations, when I was in the Netherlands, I spoke to an artist called Femi Otten, who was given a very prestigious residency in the United States by the Mondriaans Fund. And when they discovered that she was pregnant, they removed that residency from her. So there was no flexibility about, for example, allowing her to defer for a year until she'd had a child. And I think quite often artists feel really scared about making it publicly known that they are parents, because they are worried that, for example, they won't be accepted on a residency, that they won't be given a commission for a public work, they won't be accepted into a biennial, they won't be allowed into an exhibition because they'll be seen as being demanding or, you know, somehow difficult. So it's really for the institution or the residency to open up that conversation really early on and to have conversations with the artist about what they need. That might be more flexible timing, more time to prepare. They might need, they might ask you to defer by a year, but not giving that flexibility to artists means that you quite often can exclude an artist from participation. Point 3 is assume that any artist parent may need to travel with their child or children and a partner or other caregiver and provide for this. So this goes for when you're installing a show in a museum or in a commercial gallery, and also for residencies. Point 4, agree with the artist at the outset what's expected of them and when, and give enough lead time so that they can plan accordingly. Don't make urgent last-minute requests for texts, talks, and other extras. So this is just basic good practice. There is this kind of general assumption in the art world that any artist is essentially going to be a carefree white man in his 30s without mobility issues, without mental health issues. They're going to have abundant free time and they're going to be able to respond to any email pretty fast. In fact, most people in their lives have some area of vulnerability, and we should probably accommodate that in the way that we deal with them. Also, as an artist, it's really important that you establish boundaries around your creative practice, that you're not necessarily there responding to things 24/7. So laying out exactly what's going to be required of an artist and expected of an artist very early on in the process of working with them is really important. Consider having a specific budget for an artist's childcare costs. In the UK, this is just like crazy talk. There's no way that this would generally happen, but it's a really good thing to think about. I know in Switzerland, with residencies, they're certainly thinking about providing money for childcare costs so that artists can have more free time for their work on a residency. But also, we have a big issue in the UK with childcare where if you're a self-employed person, and that could include being an artist, you can't count childcare as a working cost, so you can't count it against your tax as part of your work expenses, which is a big issue, and I don't know whether that's also the case here. Schedule openings and special events as convenient to artist parents. Consider options such as weekend brunch private views rather than sticking rigidly to early evenings, when children need to be fed, bathed, and put to bed. I recently learnt this new phrase, the arsenic hour. I think it's a phrase from the United States, but it refers to that point at the end of the afternoon when kids have got really ratty, when the parents have, like, your coffee's worn off, when you've still got to do tea time, bath time, and bedtime. And unfortunately, this tends to happen at kind of 6 o'clock in the evening, which is exactly when most private views happen. It's exactly when most museum talks happen. It's exactly when performances happen. And it means that if you have a nursery or a primary school aged child, in general, you are cut off from all of these events. These events aren't just like nice events where you're going to see an exhibition. They're also the times when the art world tends to network. They are when you, as an artist, particularly if you're working from home, get to catch up with your peer group. They're when you become part of the discourse. You learn what people are reading, what people are seeing, what people are talking about. You get to perhaps meet curators or other art world professionals, gallerists, and writers. So if you're cut off from that kind of period of networking, you can end up feeling extremely isolated and potentially quite invisible in the art world. Point 7, be aware of term dates and program around them. Offer artists who need to travel with children the option of installing a show over half term or during school holidays, for example. Alternatively, that could also mean if you have older children that an artist might want to install a show during term time so that their child's in school. But again, it's all to do with having conversations with people. Rethink or remove age limits for residencies and awards so that they can become inclusive of artists whose careers have been interrupted by having and caring for children. This also would go for any artist that's had to take time away from the art world to deal with physical or mental health issues, for artists who have difficult socioeconomic circumstances, who are having to prioritize paid work. At the moment, the art world is really difficult to get back into, let's say, if you're a middle-aged person. Quite often, awards and residencies come with an age limit. They're designed to support, shall we say, emerging artists. And this idea that you might actually be stuck at the age of 45 or 50 trying to get back into the art world is not really considered. And certainly middle-aged women are not seen as an exciting proposition by the art world. This is really a point for residencies, but work with residencies to adapt them to fit an artist's needs if they're travelling with a family. And then point 10, again, this goes back to the ageist issue in the art world. Don't read gaps on a CV to indicate a lack of commitment or effort. Artists' careers come in many shapes and are paused for many reasons, parenting among them. Emerging artists are not always those who graduated most recently. So in the kind of working world, in the office world, this idea about looking at people's CVs differently is becoming, I think, more accepted. So LinkedIn quite recently, I think only last year, introduced a new offer when you present your CV on LinkedIn. So you can put a little kind of automatic notice next to any gaps on your CV to explain that this was a period taken out to spend time with your family, to care for children, to for reasons of ill health, or just for some kind of sabbatical. And it turned out that employers were much more happy to consider somebody if they knew why there was a gap on the CV. There are also certain artist groups who have made a kind of radical point of including the birth of their children on their CVs. So Kunst und Kind in Berlin do this as a kind of political gesture. So when they have a child, they put it onto their CV as a creative act, which is apparently seen as being really quite unacceptable. In the kind of German art scene, you really don't talk about being a parent and having children. So most recently I published this book, which I don't know whether it's in the bookshop here. I'm hoping it might be in the bookshop here. Unfortunately, because my country made this terrible decision, we have Brexit. It's become extremely expensive to buy books from the UK. So, and I apologise for that, but it is available as an ebook, and I'm going to be doing an audiobook of it quite soon. I'm going to just look at one section that one section of the book. So the book's really divided between the kind of historic context and then looking at the current situation for artist parents. We go through art schools, studio practice, which is very affected if you have, if you're working from home as an artist. It really changes the kind of work you make. And then we look at residencies, relationships with commercial galleries, and relationships with big institutions. So this really is just a little kind of quick scoot through art schools. So this is another artist that I interviewed for my study. Like many of the people in academia that I interviewed, she did not want her name shared, which I think is really eloquent about quite how toxic the world of academia is in relation to parents. She says, when I was an undergraduate student in the 1990s, the mature female students in their 30s and 40s were called knitters. Do you know what knitting is? So knitting's when you're working with wool. By the male lecturers because they said they weren't making real art. They also described the full-time female lecturers as part-timers because they left work on time to go home to their families. A former colleague of mine as recently as 2014 pointed to a book on my office bookshelf about mother artists and said he always made a point to tell each year group that the girls shouldn't have children because their careers would be over and they'd have nothing to say anymore. So there are 4 points here that I think really epitomise, certainly in the UK and the US, the prevailing attitudes in art schools towards motherhood as a state and as a subject. First of all, we've got this idea that women in their 30s and 40s are knitters. And I'd imagine this to be a group that are perhaps coming to art schools or postgraduate study after having a family, after starting a family. And really for people, when they start a family, quite often the first thing that goes is their studio because it becomes too expensive to take time away from paid work and to support a small child and to pay for a studio. So quite often people start working at home in a very interrupted way in the times that they have available between a child's nap time and perhaps in the evening at night. And they'll be working from their kitchen table. So that affects immediately the scale of the work they're making, but also the kind of work that they're making. Quite often they're making something that's small, but they will also be making work that can be picked up and put away very quickly, which means probably not oil painting, which is obviously very messy and requires a lot of cleanup time. Probably not large works in sculpture or, welding or in something that requires power tools. So quite often people really start to work in media that we associate with craft traditions. So that could be indeed knitting, fibre work, crochet work, textile work. It could be ceramics. It could be indeed making stuff on a computer. So that this association of kind of middle-aged women with knitting, I think, actually does reflect a reality that quite often people will be coming back into art school in middle age, having been working in more of a craft tradition. But the idea that that isn't real art, I think, is something that we really need to examine. And this prejudice around media that historically have this relationship with women's work in the home. This thing about part-timers, I think, really goes to the, I think Hito Steyl talks about unpaid labour being the dark matter that holds the art world together. And there's really this expectation that we're in this wonderful, privileged art world, so we should be really happy to give our labour free and to work overtime, to work nights, to work weekends. This thing about your career being over when you have a child, I think it's a really old prejudice, but I certainly remember in my generation, when I was studying in the 1990s, the beginning of the 1990s, many of my artist contemporaries felt that they would never have a child because if they had a child, they started a family, they would not be seen as a serious artist anymore, which is not a decision that male artists have to make, but female and non-binary artists for a very long time faced this prejudice that they wouldn't be serious artists if they started a family. And this lovely idea that you'd have nothing to say anymore if you started a family, because obviously, giving birth, motherhood in the domestic realm, that's nothing to say. I mean, this is like one end of the axis of life and death. But very much in art schools, when I interviewed artists about their experience at art schools, if they'd been making work about motherhood, they were told off by their tutors, it was put down by their tutors, and they were told that they were making mummy art, and this wasn't a subject matter for great art. So we have, a really quite serious historic prejudice just around this as a subject. Before I get on to that as a subject, I think there's also a structural issue in art schools. Certainly in the UK, it's very much expected now that artists will do an MA course, so they will go on to, a postgraduate education. Quite often they'll take a break after their BA, so they'll go into the MA, let's say, in their late 20s or their 30s, and quite often that will then correspond with the time where they discover that they're pregnant or that they've been pregnant. And art schools just aren't considering this in general. I mean, there are a few exceptions, but in general, art schools are not considering the fact they might have people that need one of these on site. So this isn't an image from some kind of hippie left-wing feminist organisation. This is from UNICEF. This is part of UNICEF's guidelines around accommodating mothers and parents in the workplace. And any workplace that has a significant number of people of childbearing age is meant to have one of these if they have a certain number of employees. This is a lactation room. It's a space where you can pump milk if you need to, or where you can breastfeed if necessary. And it should have a comfortable chair, electricity, a refrigerator. It should be really clean. It should have access to Wi-Fi. I can't think of any art school that has one of these, but there should be one of these on campus for a university as well. There is, of course, an art historical issue with mothers. There's what I refer to as a mother-shaped hole in art history, as well as on the campus. Part of this is to do with image. We're meant to be terribly deep and thoughtful in the art world, but actually in many ways we're quite superficial. And this whole thing about cool and buzz and kind of bohemian image is still really important, particularly in the commercial sector. I'm sure lots of you have read Maggie Nelson's book, The Argonauts, and she uses this phrase in The Argonauts of the sodomitical mother. That came from a book by Susan Freeman called Cool Men and the Second Sex. And Susan Freeman in this book really dissects the construction of cool in the mid-century, and she talks about this kind of, this young rebellious man. And of course, what is the young rebel rebelling against? They're rebelling against their mother. So within that structure, the place occupied by the mother is by definition uncool. So this again is another kind of hurdle that we need to get around in this subject. I think it also is something that we need to consider when we discuss art historically. So there's been a huge amount of work done in the last few years looking at gender balance in art history. We've reclaimed a lot of forgotten artists, but quite often what happens with these artists is that we kind of jam them into the structures that already exist in the art world, so the art historical narrative that exists, and we just kind of shovel women in there and don't necessarily ask why they might not fit so comfortably. This is a painting by Artemisia Gentileschi. It was painted in 1613. Which was the year that she had her first child. We tend to think of Artemisia as this wronged woman who'd been through this terrible trauma and that, was painting all of these kind of bloodthirsty revenge paintings. We tend to think less about her in this role. As far as I know, although I'm working with an artist in Ghent, who I think is investigating this for me, this is the earliest painting of a woman breastfeeding painted by another woman who has experience of breastfeeding. And it's, I think it's quite a remarkable painting. But I think it's also interesting to think about Artemisia as a mother, as somebody that gave birth to 5 children, only one of whom lived to adulthood. This is an artist called Mary Beale, who was quite successful in the 1660s and 70s in London. She worked particularly painting, again, children in the domestic realm, so that was seen as very much a lesser subject. But what's interesting here is that her status as a mother is being flaunted in this self-portrait. So it's not seen as an impediment to her success. It's seen as an advertising point. So this is very much her advertising her skill. She's here with a painting of her 2 sons. And likewise, Elizabeth Louise Vigée-Lebrun paints herself here with her beautiful daughter. And this, again, is an advertisement for her skill as a portraitist and as somebody that can paint children. So here she is looking gorgeous with her daughter looking adorable. This was quite a scandalous painting, not because of the child, but because she's showing her teeth in the painting, which was considered to be not particularly respectable because the French aristocracy at the time had terribly rotten teeth. So there is this kind of double bind that we encounter with these artists who've been written out of art history, that because they're painting perhaps children in the domestic realm, that was then seen as like a woman's area to paint, to look at. And there's a kind of catch-22 where if you're considering women to be less good than men, then by definition, children in the domestic realm were less important subjects for art. There's also, of course, a genuine hazard to motherhood. Part of that, actually just even getting married, means that as an artist you quite often lose your name. So this is an artist called Edna Waugh, who was supremely talented. She was a prodigy. She went to the Slade School of Art in London, I think at the age of 13 or 14, and won all of the, she won loads of awards. She was part of a very, very highly talented group of women that went to the Slade School in the 1890s. But when she got married, she started signing her work Edna Clark Hall. So there's this kind of gap between these two identities she had, between her early work as an artist and her later work after having children. And again, she wasn't supported by her husband, so she really disappeared for quite a long time. And so there are essentially 2 bodies of work with 2 different names on them. Of that group of 4 women that went to the Slade in the 1890s, we've got Edna Waugh, Gwen Salmon and Ida Nettleship. The 4th is the one in the UK who's remembered. She's called Gwen John. And her work is quite present in British collections. And she was quite successful during her lifetime. She had a very important collector who supported her called John Quinn. And she is the only one of the 4 who did not get married and did not have children. She wrote at the time that she said she wanted a life free from family convention and ties. But the hazards of motherhood were not just to do with losing your name. They were also physical hazards. So this is Ida Nettleship, one of the 4. She married Gwen John's brother, Augustus John, and she died at the age of 30, having given birth to 5 children in 6 years. And when she was pregnant with one of the 4th or 5th child, she wrote to a friend, "It may only be because there's nothing else to do, now that painting is not practicable, and I must create something." And I think this is a very contemporary idea that motherhood is a creative act as well. I think it's kind of amazing that she's thinking in that way. But she clearly felt quite desperate that she was there running after, 4 children, and she was cut off from this great talent that she had of painting. There's also this invisibility of motherhood within the kind of the bohemian avant-gardes of the early 20th century. So this is Jacqueline Lombard. She was an artist, and she also used to perform naked in a tank of water in a cabaret in Paris, which is where she met André Breton, who she married, who was obviously the father of surrealism. But André Breton didn't really want to see her as an artist, and she looked after their child together, Aube. When their relationship was breaking down, she said to a friend, he saw in me what he wanted to see, but he didn't really see me. So this idea that he would see her both as a mother and an artist was just not going to happen. And, you know, that whole, we look at this kind of the avant-garde of the early 20th century in their attempts to have new lifestyles, to have, you know, open relationships, to be more sexually progressive. It's all very well, but generally it ends up being the women that pick up the baby at the end of it, and so they become invisible as a result. She actually had an extraordinary life. She was close to Frida Kahlo. I think they may have been lovers. Certainly the letters between the two of them are very amorous. This is one of the few women who was allowed to exhibit with the Surrealists, Eileen Agar, and she said she wanted something more worthwhile than the usual repetitive routine of marrying and having a brood of children. Again, she was allowed into the boys' club because she didn't become a mother. And this prejudice kind of keeps wheeling on through the century. It's definitely seen that if you're a woman in a man's world, and the art world very much was and continues to a certain extent to be a man's world, then it's very, very difficult to do it with the baby in tow, if not completely impossible. So this is Carolee Schneemann, who did become pregnant early in her career, while it was still illegal to have an abortion in the United States. So she traveled to Cuba and had an illegal abortion without anesthetic. And she remembers even through the pain this feeling of freedom coming to her, that she wouldn't have to look after a child. She later wrote in this essay, Anti-Demeter, her feelings of experiencing pregnancy at that point. "You're not invited into my body. I did not invite an alien being, a child, into my future. I had a mountain to climb. Pregnancy was constant pissing and terror, not nausea but terror. I was taken over. I was no longer an I." So this is her expressing, in part, the difficulty of succeeding in this very male-dominated art world, where she was having a tough time. She was not accepted. And she had a mountain to climb and she couldn't carry a child with her. But I think there's also this experience of losing her identity, losing this sense of individuality, which is still something that's commonly experienced by parents. The only, certainly in the United Kingdom, the only work on the subject of motherhood that's really been admitted into the kind of canonical works of the feminist avant-garde is Mary Kelly's postpartum document, which used nappy liners and documented her child's development in quite psychoanalytic language over the course of 7 years. But Mary Kelly was very much presenting it as of a part with conceptual art, with minimalism, with this idea of seriality and repetition, but looking at that from the context of motherhood. One work that I quite wanted just to briefly consider before we go through into the discussion is Mila Ladiman-Eucalis's Manifesto for Maintenance Art, made in 1969. So this started off as a proposal to an institution for an exhibition in which she'd bring her everyday work as a caregiver into the context of an institution and perform her duties such as cleaning and looking after the child and cooking in a gallery situation. But in it, it's quite a long document. You can find it online if you want to see it. She makes this crucial distinction between what she calls development work, which is the work that you'd consider to be the normal kind of work of an artist or of a great male artist, which is pure individual creation, the new, change, progress, advance, excitement, flight or fleeing, and maintenance work, which she explains as keeping the dust off the pure individual creation, preserve the new, sustain the change, protect progress, defend and prolong the advance, renew the excitement, repeat the flight. And she has this lovely phrase, after the revolution, who's going to pick up the garbage on Monday morning? So she wanted to propose maintenance work also as serious art that should be considered by the institution. And I think those of us who also work in institutions perhaps need to consider the way that we keep going with this idea of maintenance. So many of the people that perform maintenance activities in the art world, be they curators or gallerists or artist liaisons, quite often are women doing the maintenance work around the men who get to do, the development work. And I'm not going to read this out loud because we may have small children that understand English in the audience, but I think this is quite a neat encapsulation. So here she is doing some of her maintenance work. Just before, was that the end of my, I think that might be the end of my presentation. I was, just before we go into the discussion, just briefly going to mention something I've started in the United Kingdom called the Art Working Parents Alliance, which is not for artist parents, it's for art workers, so for curators, technicians, gallerists, people working in the auction houses, academics and educators, all of whom are parents, because I've realized that actually many of these people also face quite big structural prejudices as well, on structural impediments. So at the moment we are working with WhatsApp groups of people, we're sharing experiences, and we're doing studies into, for example, things like maternity leave, and we are working towards a symposium in July at the Whitechapel Gallery in London to work with lawyers, union representatives and people who are kind of HR experts to put together tools for best practice, codes of best practice, so that people can negotiate for better contracts as part-time workers and as parents in the art world. So do ask me if you want to know more about that afterwards. I am now going to welcome onto stage Sara, Anita and Rossana. Please can you join me for a conversation? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hettie. That was extremely interesting. Some pieces very recognizable, but also lots of things for us to learn as an institution and as curators. Yeah, I didn't do a thorough presentation of Hettie before she started speaking, unfortunately. I will say some more words now. As you have all understood, Hettie is a critic, a curator, and a writer. And her latest book, which she mentioned, How Not to Exclude Artist Mothers and Other Parents, is not on sale in the bookshop right now, but it will come. It will come shortly. Yeah, we blame Brexit. So it will be available and also in our web shop. And the manifesto that Hettie mentioned in her lecture, if someone wants to put it up on her website in Swedish, that would be amazing. It's already has been translated into 15 languages. Hettie is currently also working on a touring exhibition and a book for the Haywood Gallery in London called On Art and Motherhood. I don't think you mentioned that, Hettie, but I mention it now. And that show will open in 2024. Now we have the panel in place. So next to Hettie, we find Sara Edström, who is the chairwoman of KRO, the Artist Association in Sweden, representing 3,500 artists and designers. Sara is also a practicing artist, and she's one of the founders of Galleri Syster that exists in Luleå since 16 years back. Yes. Rossana sits next to Sara. And Rossana is an artist and a cultural worker based in Stockholm. She explores decolonial feminist practices, public spaces and collective work, racified femininity and immigration. Rossana is one of the initiators of the feminist street art collective Hysterics in Peru, focusing on multidisciplinary interventions in the public sphere. And next to Rossana, we have Anita Wernström-Pitcher, who's my colleague. Anita is a curator at the learning department here at Moderna Museet, and her responsibility is activities and programs for children aged 0 to 12. Anita is also an artist. She was trained in Slade School of Fine Art in London. She has a BA in Fine Art. And in her work as an artist as an educator, she focuses on performance art, public spaces, and self-organizing on the art scene as well in civic society. And all the panelists are mothers. So I will be standing here. I will also moderate questions that come in on our Facebook online event. So there will be questions for you, for the audience, to ask the panel later, and I will also take questions from online viewers. But now I leave over the word to Hettie, who will be moderating the panel.
Thank you, Camilla. I mean, I'd be really interested to know your relative experiences in relation to the things I was talking about, because it was, although I've spoken to artists around the world, I guess my context is the UK, which is not particularly welcoming necessarily to artist parents. Sara, I know you've got so many hats.
Yeah.
With your hat on representing this large group of artists in Sweden, what do you see the biggest issues affecting mothers or parent artists as being over here?
Well,
or is it
thank you so much for your presentation, and I was just thinking all the time that these are things that I'm like that is so important. At the same thing, it feels like we all know this. We have known this for such a long time, and I'm always thinking that it always comes back to like the overall conditions of being an artist, and then it just magnifies, amplifies when all these other aspects then come in. We talk now about parenthood, motherhood, but we could talk about all these other different things that is, as soon as you are like 1 millimeter outside the norm, and then 2 millimeters, and then like we are all affected by it. So of course it's like the overall conditions of artists not being paid enough, not being like seen as doing proper work, and you know, we're supposed to just you know, survive in this kind of context that we're now talking about, the art scene, but like we're supposed to survive in it by not pretending that we have all these other things. We're just supposed to be like some entity that's floating around without having all these other things affecting our lives. And now we talk about parenthood, motherhood, in my case, but there's so many other things. And so I'm just always coming back to this basic conditions of being able to choose art as your profession, and like you also said, like we need all these different perspectives. I mean, it becomes like boring. It becomes more and more unnecessary if just one perspective is presented all the time. So yeah, well, and
if you could change one thing, what would be the thing that you think would make the most difference over here?
Well, the people who are like in charge of making the norm, the people who are in charge of saying that motherhood is not a topic, you don't have anything to talk about if you're like these people, the people of power in all kinds of ways, of course, in the art institutions and everywhere, those people have to be not only, you know, cisgendered males, you know, that's like, so the power structures have to change. We cannot work with all these different projects that will include artists, but if we don't change the power structures, and where the power and the money is, that's where if that is changed with the new perspectives there, where all these different topics are just absolutely självklara, of course, then it changes. But the ones in charge have to change. And so, well, so where's the power? Where's the money? Who is in charge? Who is setting the norms? So.
Yeah. Rossana, you've worked as an artist mother in Sweden, and I'd love to hear a little bit about your experiences and the things that have gone right and the things that you've found really challenging here, because I know that we in the UK, we really idealize Sweden and the kind of social model you have over here, but I'm sure that it's not all roses and chocolate cake.
Yeah. Well, yes, I have been working and living here in Sweden for 4 years, and I mean, I since I have moved here with a son who was already 8 years old, and I still work with people and colleagues from Peru, the country I was born, I have a perspective that could be a bit wider in that sense. So when I think about motherhood, for example, and how that has been included in my work, probably the focus of my work has been to detect through my own life how the legal system or institutionality in the form of state has is like an ally to patriarchy and coloniality to oppress women, and in my case, precisely women who are non-Europeans who migrate here. So in my case, I could say that art could have been seen as a platform where we could have talk about these issues that are very structural, more than, I mean, personal and political, but they are very structural and usually are not seen as a problem for women or for mothers who are from Sweden. Because unfortunately, I could mention that when we talk about racialized motherhood or racialized womanhood in general, there's a lot of aspects that only exist when you are living in that situations. Otherwise, it's not really recognized as a problem because you're not even seen as a woman or as a human. So, for example, a couple of years ago, we did an intervention and centrifuge in Konstnärskap where we talked about institutional violence against women, mainly mothers here in Sweden. Because I did the first part of this project with my own process in Peru to get full custody of my child, which is another very strong process that I had to go through, where you need to prove how good of a good victim you are, and you need to prove how good of a good mom you are, and you have all these intersectional violences going on through your body. And you need to prove the love of the child and how a lot of things. And moving here, that process was still extremely violent, but in another level. So in this project, we could talk about how just until now, some women need to fight for the basic right to be next to their child, how they are separated just because they are non-Europeans and they might be separated for years from their children. So we use the space to talk about this, even though I was here, and the processes gives another layer of this violence. So of course, a lot of friends that I have invited today are artists, and they have been talking about this. Sorry, it's not a contagious cough. It's how over all the violence and the oppressions and exclusions that we're talking about, when you are extra surveilled, that it's not just people looking bad at you, but it can also go to being taking your kids away from with the social workers, or that if you don't prove these or certain patterns as a good mother, then you might lose, you and your kid might lose a residence permit, and things like this are take another level of frightening. But I also think that it gives another level of a strategy. Like sometimes when we talk about, when you were talking about the residencies or the art education, and sometimes you learn to navigate around them. So in that sense, I could say that I also could expand a bit of the idea of caring for people, being the responsible of caring, because we are talking about parenthood as the sole institution where you are responsible of children, which is also a very kind of new contemporary modern idea. Like this is kind of invented somehow, and because the usual was that children were a kind of community responsibility, and like colonialism was just took the work that was from a family or a community and gave it to the men, and also that's something kind of new, let's say. But I would say that I know a lot of people also from my country where the state probably is not strong father giver, as we can see sometimes in here, that the taking care of the children or taking care of the elderly or the sick is work that is not done just by the mothers. Sometimes it also is relegated to the person who doesn't have children, and they need to stay with parents to take care of them when they're older, or the children of other people, of the relatives, because the other relatives who have the children need to go to work. So, and this is also capitalism and all of this. So I think it's, I don't know, it's a lot of layers that I could discuss here about it. And now also my child is already 12. So every time the kid grows, it's your system and network is the how you do your strategies to be able to participate, or to sometimes you don't even ask if it's okay. You just need to do it because otherwise I have done that a lot of times. And also it depends on so many things when you can bring your kids or not. It depends where you live. If you live 2 hours from the place, like in Lima, also there's elitist spaces in the city, and everything is 2 hours away. So it's all very intersectional, I could say also.
Yeah, there's so much that came up. So I feel like I could spend the next kind of couple of hours kind of discussing all of the things you throw up. There are so many interesting things that came up in that. I mean, I think this thing of also alternative models for parenting is such an interesting and hot topic at the moment. I was reading a book called Queer Nursing on the way up here, which is very much looking at this idea of, trying to, part of it's very much having like quite a large social group around you, having a community around you, and not just making it about the person that's like nursing actively. And there are so many interesting initiatives around trying to bring that communal model back up again. But I think also this thing of the different models for child rearing, but not only the different models for child rearing, but the different needs of children at different ages. Because of course we can have an event like this which is baby friendly, but then if you have kids that are like 5, 6, 7, they're not going to want to be in here. Your 12-year-old probably doesn't want to come to the museum. No, my children used to rebel so much against going to art events and things. So that also then becomes, the needs change at different points. It's one thing when you've got a baby that's mobile, but as you say, you face quite different structures as you kind of go up the parenting. Anita, it was really great seeing your film at the start here. Was that a new initiative?
Yes, that's something we did a little bit quickly here with Justin just before this event. Yeah.
So historically, I mean, you've worked in institutions for a while. Historically, how do you see the institutional relationship to mothers, to families? I mean, it's different. Quite often, institutions have family-related activities, but to mothers in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is very different, and it's also this idea of like having family activities, but then also how do you include female mother artists actually displaying in the art gallery. I mean, they're two very different ways, but I think Moderna Museets got an amazing tradition in being including and also focusing on activities for parents and children, and doing it in a very serious way. Actually, this way of having proper tours for children and listening to children, and also practicing this idea of communication, which I think is one of those really amazing things about an art collection. And also we're a public space, and something I've been thinking a lot about within the institution and how you perceive an institution or a museum is actually that we should be a place of learning, a constant place of learning and developing. And I think sometimes you forget about that when you do visit a museum or a collection, that there's so much to learn constantly.
And I'd be really interested to hear having seen my talk, whether there was anything that you kind of went, oh wow, and we should, that made you see the way an institution should behave differently, or whether there were things that I'd not thought of that you guys are already doing, because you're very progressive here.
I think it's fantastic about this idea of actually hosting this event. I don't think we would have done that if it wasn't so that you had the invitation to come, which is absolutely amazing. And but we do have a very child-friendly approach, but maybe we should address it more and actually do make families feel very much more welcome, but also maybe thinking about how we can make artist parents to feel that the Moderna Museet is actually a space for them, and to actually have these deeper intellectual conversations that you wish to have with your peers, even though if you got children. So I think that's something very important.
No, it was. I talk about it in the book, but there was a group in Chicago that experimented with having Saturday morning talks, so they also had like a play area for the kids separately.
Yeah.
which became incredibly popular. But they said they hosted them for a number of museums. The museums loved them, but then weren't prepared to institute them themselves. And I just heard from a friend in London that apparently the Barbican has like a soft play area somewhere in it, which I didn't know about at all. So the idea of actually having like an area for kids in the museum, like for quite small children, is really interesting. But I mean, it's maybe, you know, and it maybe does free up parents in a different way to be able to experience art.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Sarah, do you?
I just wanted to comment on that because, like you said, I've been running Gallery Sister for 16 years, and we are like really talking about this a lot, like to include ourselves as human beings and artists, and you know. But even though I hadn't actually thought about having the openings in a motherly friendly hour, because usually we do that like Friday afternoons, just like that. And so even if you try to be like really conscious about these things, that was like something that I feel like, wow, I'm so ashamed I didn't think about that. And so like these little tools is really helpful to just like state the obvious, and I didn't even think about it. So I appreciate that.
Just before we open up to questions from the audience, Rossana, I just wanted to quickly go back to you, because I feel like in the UK there's a big like a dividing line between what we could think of as work that's being made and shown in like artist-run spaces that's more socially conscious, and then it feels like there's a massive separation between that and what happens at the institutional level and in the commercial galleries. Yeah. And that a lot of the discussions that are happening in, let's say, more artist-run spaces around parenthood and other intersectional issues are not particularly visible at the level of the, you know, at different levels in the art world. How do you feel that is in Sweden? Do you feel, because you work maybe more in kind of artist-run spaces?
Yes, I could. Yeah, sometimes I was wondering also, like, what does it mean to have an artistic production or career? Because sometimes I have heard like a real artist means that you need to make your main income from art or things like this, or have the studio or things like that. I don't think I work in different spaces, mainly artist-run spaces, but I have worked also in konstvärlden here, in like the cultural centers here that are mainly conjoined with municipality work necessarily. But also, like, before I moved here, when I had my child, I worked in Peru. Basically, my main paid job has always been either as art, like cultural facilitator, or different types of work. But the artistic production could have, the only way that it has been possible to produce it is due to networks, due to having the relevance comes from having a network of people who are also doing stuff. And in that way, basically, I started working more collectively, and that's how I also Aesthetics was born in Lima, and also now we have an organization here called La de Coloniala. My friends here are Princess and Natalie are here from the organization. Was also a way to create spaces because for some time I didn't have a document to be able to apply for funding and certain things. So in this way we were also playing a bit with the organizational way to do our own production and look for spaces. And if there was not spaces, then we create them. So I don't know precisely. Primarily I have been working in self-organized situations or places that are around either by municipality and / cultural centers. But of course, I would say that the discussions and the problematics that we are bringing should be discussed as structural problems or issues, as I was mentioning, and as you were mentioning, that if we talk about caring as a woman's issue, or I don't know, feminicides or patriarchy as a woman's problem, then nothing will happen. Or Now, when we talk also about violence here in Sweden, they always an immigration problem. It's not an immigration problem; it's a Swedish problem. So things like this need to be broader. So I'm glad that we have the platform here to talk about this. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that that division. Probably because I don't work so much with commercial galleries and stuff. I don't know that.
Thank you. I think we should open up to questions. You okay to receive some questions from the audience?
Fantastic.
Now, would you take your mic, please? Do we have questions from the audience? Yes, in the back and in the front. I think the person in the back was the first one.
Dustin has one.
Justin has it.
Maybe I can just quickly comment before the mic arrives there about this institutional way of like who is doing, like you said, the figures are reversed, like who is when you come to the galleries or the big shows, it's more men. So of course, from my perspective as working with the art organization, I always think about the structures, and that I think is really important. This CV gaps that you can really explain. Because we all know that if your CV has these gaps, you immediately become like a bit. People get a bit suspicious of what have you been doing. And I think that is so strange because we are all human beings with all different types of things, not that we have to do besides being an artist. So that shouldn't be a disadvantage for us. I think that's very important to always bring up when we talk to institutions that give us funding, artist residencies, and all that kind of stuff. And also, of course, all kinds of different aspects of having the big exhibition and stuff.
Yeah, for sure. We got a question back here.
The mic should be on, yes.
Check. Okej. Okej, vi använder den här micken istället.
Hi. Yeah. Okay. So I just want to add, maybe to expand a bit more of what Rossana was speaking and about what Sara said regarding the power structures and institutional support. Maybe take it as well to sort of the role of us as individuals and how we deal with these cases that might not be the same as one experience. And in that sense, I want to share my own experience that might be interesting. I was actually accepted to a school here in Sweden when I was pregnant, and I actually chose what you commented, not to say it to school, because I was fearful of losing my space there. This was in 2010. At that time, the whole system here in Sweden changed. So before, as students, we weren't required to pay if we were non-European. So I was accepted as the last person within that system. But that implied that when I communicated, I accepted my place in a school that is very close. And but what happened was that once I had to start my studies, obviously I just gave birth. I gave birth, so I asked for maternity leave, which again here in Sweden is something that is great. There's a lot of support in that sense, so there was no problem to delay my studies. But that also meant that because of the change, I had to come and start the studies before my child was 1, which also came to be, what I had to do was to stop breastfeeding when my child was 9 months and come without my child to be able to start my studies, or else I would lose my opportunity to study. This actually meant leaving my child twice because of migration issues. What I want to share is that this anecdote that as soon as I was accepted to the school, one of our professors actually introduced me as maybe the last person that would be able to study for free here in Sweden in an art school. And it was interesting because a person in my class actually commented that, and you have to understand at that point I was without my child, with what the toll that it took on my body, the cut of breastfeeding, and which is a very emotional period, and being without my child. And this person commented that, well, it was fair because Swedish citizens shouldn't be paying with their taxes for people like me that would come from abroad Europe. So this is the first time I share this. I've been working here in Sweden for almost 10 years. Of course, my child is good. We live here. I was a single mother in here for 7 years, which was the hardest thing that I've done in my life, with no network. Of course, after that comment, I learned that the least that I could depend on was in other people in here. Not network, no support, no way. I mean, when I asked my professor how could I start integrating to the local art scene, he immediately said, well, you need to go to openings. And I said, well, I have a small child, a 2-year-old. I can't go unless I go with a stroller, but that's really, it won't work. He was like, okay, you won't be able to make it then. So I just wanted to share this because it's true that it's a very progressive place, that I wouldn't have been able to do this probably in any other country. But at the same time, I thought it was important to see, to sort of think beyond just the institution and the power structure, but just, again, in the individual and how we assume other people or other experiences to be when we're just confronted to them with really knowing what the other is experiencing. And maybe here it's interesting because, again, here in Sweden, being a mother is quite comfortable compared to other countries. But that doesn't mean that it's the same for everyone. So just a comment.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you.
And there was a question here in the front.
Yes.
Here,
yeah.
Here, second row.
Hello. I just wanted to talk about the responsibility about who has the responsibility to expand or be more flexible when it comes to mothering an artist. And I lived in London for 13 years, and I studied there. I did a master's at the RCA, and then I moved here, and I became a mother. So I didn't have the sort of SGI, which we call. It's it's sort of your income becomes the base of what you get, what the government pays out for your maternity leave, or if you're ill or whatever. And also, as an artist in Sweden, you have to create a company. You can't be self-employed. You have to do VAT and pay 40% taxes of your income that goes to social blah blah blah. Anyway, it was after I became a mother, I felt this individual crisis coming in, the isolation and being invisible and without a network as well, even though I am Swedish. But I'm not from here. So I started emailing loads of museums in Gothenburg, where I live, and galleries, doing can you create artists in residencies for mothers for locally, so I don't have to be away from my child, so I can. And I could be helping to organize this, and I was doing tons of research and sending it out to everyone, and they were like, no, we're not interested. And I was like, but you can do it. The V&A in London has amazing art in residency. You can use the collection and do a contemporary way, and you get added on the CV, and you can apply to be a part of exhibitions again, because you sort of actualized. And no one was interested, and I tried to apply to do a PhD at the Art Museum and combine science, because there was 2016 there was a research that came out about how pregnancy changes the brain. There's mass decay of brain cells that sort of shapes the brain while you're pregnant. And I wanted to see, but isn't it interesting, how does it affect your creativity? How does it... Anyway, I finally got money to sort of set up a local residency. So I did it's called Mothers in Residence, and we rent a studio in a artist collective place and have residencies there for everyone who's mothers that sort of stepped away from their art practice for looking after the family, no matter how old the children are. Anyway, but it's a massive. But what I was considering is the whole time I've been doing and reading up on this is that it's just not hot being a mom, and it's not interested, and I just think that part of being you have to take the responsibility yourself and be self-organized, but it's also part of the institutions like Moderna Museet. You could have a residency for mothers. You could, it could help to sort of, why wasn't the Art Council, Konstnärsnämnden, invited here? Because they are doing studies about how maternity changes, how we all have the same student loan, massive amounts of student loans. But when you become a mother and you stay out of the art scene, and then you're not sort of actualized, and you can't pay off your student loan by doing artwork. You have to pay it off by working in ICA. There's so many interesting issues, but I think that there's a collective responsibility about making more effort, and sort of that's what I wanted to say, really. I did notes here. Brain changes, cultural company. So that's where I wanted to come, because in the end it's just ridiculous also that artists have to be like businesses. In Sweden you're meant to carry it off like a business, and that's how if you get ill, if you get like a massive grant here, that's like 5 year good grant if you've done well as an artist, and you get it and you have it, but it doesn't count to your SGI. So if you get ill or you become a parent after you have that, you lived off this really nice scholarship, then you get nothing, because it doesn't count to your economy either. So it's like a economical death trap to be an artist in Sweden, and it's just there's so many. It's sort of it's knitted by loads of different loose threads about how to just survive to be an artist, mother. Okay, I think I could. My mouth is dry. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've got one more question up here.
Can I just quickly comment on the SGI? I like that because there is this investigation that the government is doing about, so that they are proposing now to include the grants in the income that is. So we are like really hopeful that this will go through and finally solve this problem. And of course, it has been more evident during the Corona crisis, when even more artists have been living with grants. And as you said, then it counts at zero, but it's going to change now, hopefully.
Can I ask something after that? Oh, sorry. I wanted to ask something before that, because now, since last year also, I know a lot of people who live here and have been working here several years, but they have to renew their work permit every year, because that's how you need to do if you're non-European here. And last year they changed it that you need to make a minimal amount of certain that is inconceivably high, because they want to deport as many people. So I was wondering, because I'm also in that group, that I need to prove my incomes in order just to stay, even though here I'm married, I have a kid and everything here. But I was wondering if we as a group of, because we're mothers, we're immigrants, we're non-Europeans, and we have to go through this, if this is also part of the research that is going on. Because I think also during COVID, it was proven that the institutions really can adjust and be elastic when they want to. So I was wondering if because as far as I know, we're not a small group of people who are still on this shady ground that we need to prove our finances. Of course, grants and nothing is taking us taxes. So I was wondering if we are also included in that research that is going on. I didn't know.
In the SGI research, I think that is just how you calculate if you get sick. But I will look into that. I don't know that. I don't think it's included in that investigation. But
Yeah, yeah. Oh.
Okay, so.
We have somebody with the mic ready to go. Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to introduce the added perspective of the dual punishment as a woman. So I don't work in art, but I do feel my career is very, very important. We just had a baby 2 months ago, and my husband is an artist, and we have chosen to actually let him take the majority of the parental leave and try to really have him be like the main parent in a lot of ways. And you might expect that as an artist he would get kind of criticized for taking time off and being with his child. No, he is celebrated. He is a present father that gets a lot of compliments for taking part in the parenthood and being so helpful with the baby. And me, as a woman who choose to go back early, I am instead punished by, oh, you're going to miss out. They're only little for so long. And are you sure you really want to take this short parental leave? So it's also, even if you choose as a mother to take time off, or if you choose to actually get back into work right away, that is also frowned upon. So the added perspective of, as a woman, you're punished. You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. When I was in Germany, I was introduced to this term, the Ravensmutter, which is like the raven mother, which is the bad mother that abandons her children. And it's this. It goes back to this whole thing about motherhood being politicized, and you also becoming part of, supplying new workers to the state, reproducing the labor force. There's this point where you feel like you're kind of owned by, a force external to yourself. I think we had a question up at the back. Yeah.
Is my mic on? No.
Yeah.
We have a comment on Facebook that I could read to you. It's Julia who's writing, I'm a Swedish living in the UK. I have an MFA and I am a mother of 2. The main reasons for struggling to work within the arts in the UK is the government's decision on not providing accessible childcare. I felt becoming a mother in the UK had to be forced to only be a mother and not the full identity of me, an artist and a mother. I also struggle with the institution of art, often looking at mothers making art as an institution that will only accept me if I don't bring the mother to work, and never bring it through to any of my work. My awareness of being hyper alert to spot what can ever be seen as quitch through my work and subjects. And Julia also would like Hettie to name her UK organization again. Sorry, she didn't catch that name.
So the organisation is actually Art Working Parents Alliance, but it's not an organisation for artists. It's for academics, curators, gallerists, people working in different sectors of the art world. So there is a sibling artist organisation called the Artist Parents Alliance. So if she's an artist, that might suit her better, and she can find that on Instagram. And the Art Working Parents Alliance, it has a little kind of very basic website.
Thank you. So the question.
Hi.
Is it on? Okay, great. Yeah. Thank you for your talks and presentation. It's been very enlightening. But I think what I wanted to bring up is the concept of being an artist and a culture worker, being in this unstable situation, especially teaching in the art schools or the art academies in Sweden, because you have these contracts which are time-based. So when you start off, you cannot get pregnant in case your contract is not renewed. So there are this uncertainties. So even if you do have a job, that can be taxed, and you're hired based upon your artistic merits. So you're supposed to be a practicing artist in order to get a more or less stable job. But because your stable job is also time-based, you can't get pregnant. Otherwise, you would lose everything. So I think there is this concept that Sweden is much better. But as we've seen, there are gaps in the holes, which doesn't necessarily favor parenthood, because I mean, it's possible. I mean, I know some parents who do bring their very young children to school because they can't afford to have a conflict within that. And that also goes for students who schedule when they will have a baby in order to not be in such a worse off situation. And if they're an artist couple, they would then balance. You know, it looks on a superficial level to be much, much easier, but frankly it's not. And also, one of the basic structures in Sweden is housing. If you have a child, you cannot be in the city, for most people. So if you have a child, or if you have two, then you have to have like an hour out, then you have to plan logistics from finishing work, picking up the kids, running back to the city for opening. So I think I I know for the other panels, this is the situation that it's the reality. And I think we kind of maybe forget that actually it's not easier, actually, as much as we like to think in Sweden.
I'm really interested to hear that about the situation in academia. It sounds very similar to the situations people face in academia in the UK. And that was part of the reason that I started the Art Working Parents Alliance, was because so many academic parents in academia, many of whom are also practicing artists as well, were facing these really kind of obnoxious contracts like the one that you described. So maybe we need to start Art Working Parents Alliance in Sweden as well. But I can't do that, but maybe you can.
I just have a quick comment to that as well. The combination of being an artist and having other jobs, in this case in the Art Academy, for example, that is also something that is looked upon in this investigation about the SGE, that you're supposed to be able to combine different types of income to get a proper parental leave or sick leave.
So we take one more question, and then I think we have to wrap up.
Yeah, I'm going to be very quick because my child is running around. I'm not an artist, but I work in art very much, kind of, sort of. And I just want to say that it's so ironic because I think there's also like a third layer that makes it even harder. Because I'm a mom and I decided, you know what, I want to enjoy motherhood and whatever. But also, if you are a migrant and if you're especially a black woman, it's also frowned upon if you're a mom. Historically speaking, in Sweden, minorities especially, Soma and Sami have been discouraged, in a friendly way, to not have children. Like everybody talks about Sverigedemokraterna, but the Social Democrats were openly talking about how women like me shouldn't have children because our children are criminals, very much. And that has nothing to do with class. I'm middle class. I'm brilliant. I'm smart. I come from an academic background. And when I will go to open preschool, there was always a question, when are you going to go work? When are you going to go work? So even there is lose-lose if you look like this. Because if you decide not to work, if you decide to take time off, then they are like, you're lazy, you don't want to work. What do you mean you don't want to work? I'm just taking a break. Everybody takes a break here, why can't I? And it's like, when are you going to work? When are you going to send your child to preschool? I'm going to send him to preschool, just chill. So there's also that layer of racism that, like, just having a child and looking like this in this country where people like me and people who are not cis and white Swedes are expected not to have children, not to reproduce. And I think it was extremely problematic for the Social Democrats in a country where it has sterilized Roma, where it has sterilized Sami, where it has sterilized trans people, where it has sterilized sex workers, where it has sterilized poor people, telling us that we shouldn't have children. And I'm going to keep popping children. I'm going to have 5 children just after she said that. Okay? I'm going to have 20 children. I didn't plan. I only wanted to have one child. I only wanted to have one child because my grandma had 6 and it was too much. But I'm like, you know what? I'm going to have 20 children. Yeah. And I'm going to ask all of my parental leaves and I'm going to do it because, come on. Yeah. So that's another layer. Like, even if a place is so inclusive and whatnot, but then if you if you look a certain way, if you come from a certain background, and if you got offended, I'm going to tell you that don't bother to report me to Sapo because I'm a Swedish citizen. Yeah. So they can't deport me, okay? So Don't waste your time.
Yeah. Rossana, I think you wanted to respond.
No, I was just cheering her. But yeah, I was. I can add to it very fast that actually last year also we did an intervention with sounds as a response to these comments actually who came from female politicians in here who were saying that they wanted to start like paternity control and health for immigrant women because probably we don't know that in here you're supposed to work and not pop out children. And a lot of very racist remarks coming from women towards immigrant mothers. So that when we talk about, I was mentioning this of the pressures of being a mom or how it can be, sometimes the core issues are so different when you, as Prince was saying, you look in a certain way and you have certain papers. The core issues sometimes can become a bit more raw. So in that sense, we also talk about different types of violence and using testimonies also from people who have come way before us from different exile moments and how their mothers were treated, even though they were, the country was nice to take them. A lot of their mothers faced this gynecologist violence, and they don't even know it. They were forced sterilized. They didn't even know. They didn't know the language when they came here. So there's a lot of things to question here that are actually, even though we're talking in our artistic practice from our motherhood experience, I think we're talking about the structural legal problems that are not our problems. These are a whole society problem. We're talking Sweden, we're talking Europe, we're talking also my country now in Peru. It's becoming legal now to take away. They are trying to create a legal form that they can take away your kids if you're participating in the protests that are going on right now. Like it's you're making them, put them in danger. And actually, when we're talking here about violence from police, that they want to make it illegal, that you can talk bad about the police in here, that's also a form to criminalize our children, not just us, our children too. So that gives another layer if you're a mother of a racialized kid who has stopped being a cute kid and it's becoming a teenager. That's a new layer. And we also have been talking this, my friend Sara is also there, and we have been talking about how we cope with this. Sometimes you don't want your kids to grow because they stop being cute. And then you are not afraid who is the bad guy who will come and attack them. So this is another layer that we can talk from our perspectives. And we are also moms. We're talking about this perspective. I think it gets to all of us because we're artists. So this is us too. And yes, cheer to Princess, and I hope she has 1,000 kids.
Yeah. There's an amazing artwork in the UK which actually is going into the show I'm curating at the moment by an artist called Barbara Walker. And in the UK we have a phenomenon where black men are far more likely to be stopped and searched by the police. I mean, like by many multiples than white men. And she found all of her son's stop and search warrants that he'd hidden from her. And she made paintings of him on them, which it's really painful. But
I love
yeah.
to check.
So we have one very last question or comment.
Yes, hello. Yeah, I'm a member of Mothers in Residence with Anna, and what one thing that's really important that Anna does is that she collects stories from mother artists all over Sweden that you can read on her website, and that's a really wonderful, beautiful thing. So it'd be great to hear from some of you here if you wanted to do an interview, and I believe Hettie's going to do one too.
I've done one. Yeah.
You've done one, yeah. So yeah, it's been really great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being part of this audience, being part of this experiment in a parent-friendly, baby-friendly event at the Moderna Museet. And thank you all so much, Sara, Anita and Rossana, for chatting with us and sharing this all. And to Camilla for inviting us, all of us.
Thank you so much, Hettie, and the panel. Thank you. And the audience.